If you're listening to this podcast, there's a very good chance that English is your second language. But have you ever tried to learn a third or even a fourth language? Today we've got some tips and advice that we hope will help you on your language learning journey, even if you're learning more than one language. Welcome all polyglots to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello and welcome to the podcast, especially if you're a new listener. And if you've come back to listen from listening before, thank you very much. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And with nearly 60 years of teaching experience between us, we'll help you improve your English and your other languages and take them to the next level. How are you doing, mate?
I'm doing fine, thanks. We've already recorded a couple of podcasts today, but with the help of Craig's very good quality coffee and biscuits, as usual, I'm ready to record this one too.
You do seem energized. You do seem buzzing and ready to go on this next podcast.
It's probably just the caffeine.
and the sugar maybe in the biscuits. Before we start this week, Reza, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who is currently in my conversation groups. It's really a pleasure and a lot of fun for me to do these conversation courses. Now, you know who you are. I'm not going to mention you by name, but it's just very enjoyable. So thank you for helping to make the lessons so much fun for me and for the other people in the group. So what's first this week, Reza?
We're going to start off with a voice message from Venezuela, a place very much in the news at the moment, and it's Rafael.
Hello, Reza. Hello, Craig. I hope you're doing well. Congratulations on your amazing work with this podcast. This is Rafael from Venezuela. And my question is, as a teacher, what would you recommend to someone who wants to start learning a third language? I mean, I'm afraid of losing my B1 level if I start learning a third language. I've been listening to... ¡Oy, cállate, mano!
Well, Rafael, thank you for your message there. As podcasters, we do sympathize with background noise and when people make noise when you're trying to record. We do have very special neighbors upstairs because we live in a block of flats. Well, I live in a flat in a block of flats, and Reza comes to record in my flat. And we have very noisy neighbors upstairs who seem to wait for Reza to arrive, and then they wait for him to take off his jacket and get settled. And after about 20 minutes, they decide to start cleaning their flat and moving furniture and scraping chairs. So we definitely sympathize with your recording conditions, Rafael.
Yes, Craig, if it's any consolation, I have the same trouble at home. So I give some classes online at home. And at the moment in my block of flats, they're installing an elevator. And there seems to be hours and hours and hours of silence until I start my class. And then some heavy work begins with drilling and banging, etc. So the noise, unwanted noise follows me everywhere, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, that's just life, unfortunately. So Rafael's question was learning a third language, which is a topic I don't think we've spoken about before, but it is quite an interesting one. So what do you reckon, Reza, learning a third language? You speak obviously English and fluent Spanish, but also you've got to a very high level with Valencia, which is the local language here in Valencia.
Well, I don't know about a high level. I did pass the C1, but I couldn't criticize anybody who would say that they're very surprised I passed, but I did. Let's say I've got an upper intermediate level. Whether I'm really advanced, I don't know. But yes, I do learn a third language. It's not easy. It's not easy at all, but it's very gratifying. It's very, very pleasurable.
And I've heard that learning languages also helps fight Alzheimer's because you're using your brain, you're developing your muscles in your brain, making those neural connections that people speak about. So it's very good, especially as you're getting older, to exercise your mind and practice memorizing vocabulary. Although learning a third language can sometimes interfere with your second language, especially if the two languages are similar in vocabulary or grammar. There's a word for this in linguistics. It's cross-linguistic influence. So influencing other languages where the features of one language can accidentally interfere or spill in the same way that you spill wine on the tablecloth or you spill water into another. For example, you might say in Spanish, I have 25 years, tengo 25 años, which sounds great in Spanish, but it doesn't sound very good in English because you don't say I have 25 years, you say I'm 25 or I'm 25 years old. So those kind of mistranslations where one language spills into the other can be a problem. On the other hand, it's not always a bad thing because it can help you if the languages share similarities. For example, Spanish and Italian. It's not so difficult to pick up Italian if you're a Spanish speaker, and vice versa.
Or in my case, Valencia, which is the third language which I'm learning at the moment. Obviously, there are many similarities with Spanish. So Spanish helps you a lot to guess many words. However, it can interfere. There can be the cross-linguistic influence. For example, some of the classic things that we look at in class a lot are things like in Spanish, this lo que. Lo que quiero decir, what I want to say, lo que doesn't exist in Valencia. So you get people saying, lo que vuol dir, but it's not. You have to say something like, la cosa que vuol dir. There is no way of saying lo que, but people just put it in there because you think, well, it's got to be the same as Spanish. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. And there's a few other things like that.
False friends and mistranslations can be a problem. So let's try and help listeners who are considering or who are actually learning at the moment a third or even a fourth language. One thing that's very important to do if you're starting to learn a third language is to make sure that you continue studying your second language so that you don't lose touch with it. So maintain your second language. Make sure you have a solid grasp of your second language, which means you have a good base and you feel comfortable in that second language before trying to learn a third. Keep practicing your second language regularly. Don't lose sight of it. Don't forget it. Keep having conversations in that second language, reading it, writing it, and speaking it. And this keeps it strong while you're focusing on your third language. Maybe it's like already knowing how to play the guitar quite well and then deciding to take up the violin, to start playing the violin. Different instrument, different number of strings, different technique. You still need to keep practicing the guitar, otherwise you might forget the chords.
You've just reminded me, Craig, it's almost a New Year resolution, and I make very few New Year resolutions. I promised myself this would be the year that I start to learn the mandolin, precisely because the fingering, where you put your fingers for the mandolin, are identical to a violin, which I can already play. So you've reminded me, like, it wouldn't be hard for me. I already would know what to do, more or less, with the left hand, where the fingers go. I only really have to learn what to do with the right hand. Half of the work has been done already. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I must start to learn the mandolin.
Do you have a mandolin?
No, but they're not expensive to buy. I could get one pretty easily, and it would be a bit like my third language, my third musical language, because it's so similar to the violin. It'll help me a lot. Thanks for reminding me.
Let us know. Let us know in the future when you do start practicing and taking it up, start doing it. Let us know how it goes. We'd be interested to hear about that. What's the next tip, Reza?
The next tip is to separate the languages. So although it does help if you already speak a second language to learn a third, you should make distinct contexts for each language. For example, maybe you could dedicate specific times or settings, places or atmospheres, to each language. You could study one language in the morning, for example, and the other in the evening. Yeah, so you've always got it in your mind. In my case, for example, okay, I need to improve my Spanish. Spanish in the morning, Valencia in the evening. Or the setting, the place, you could study one always at home and the other in the cafe. Though I have to admit, in theory, this is a great idea. In reality, it could be quite tricky to put that strictly into practice. But if you've got the time, it will help you keep the language separate and avoid that cross-linguistic influence, that spilling of one into the other.
Also, I don't know why, but I tend to associate Italian, for example, very much with good coffee and cafes. So I think if I decided to learn Italian, I'd quite like to do it in a cafe while I'm drinking coffee. Whereas maybe French, I could only listen to French podcasts and learn French while I was walking. And imagine I was walking around the beautiful streets of Paris. So making that distinction in environment might help you to separate the two languages.
Yeah, and if I were learning two languages and one of them was Portuguese, I would definitely keep Portuguese for the evening, because for me, Portuguese is the language of a saudade, that special melancholy. We haven't even got a word for it in English or Spanish, which both the Portuguese and the Brazilians do really well, this kind of longing, melancholy. That's a nighttime thing. I would keep Portuguese for the evening, I think. That would be my justification.
Learn it in a smoky, moody jazz bar
Exactly.
at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 a.m., yeah.
That's Portuguese for me, yeah.
It also might be an idea to use different resources for the different languages and avoid using the same type of resource for both languages so that you minimize confusion. For example, maybe you're learning German with the Duolingo app. Well, instead of adding Russian and learning Russian on Duolingo, why don't you change to a different application so that you're separating the languages on two separate language learning apps? Or you could use a textbook for Russian and maybe podcasts or a language app on your phone for German. Just a suggestion.
Although if you're learning English, I have absolutely no doubt that you should reserve most of your podcast time for English. And you don't need me to tell you which podcast you should be listening to.
This one?
Yep.
Our next tip, and you can see these, by the way, in the show notes, go to inglespodcast.com/557 to see all of these tips listed there. The next one is leverage similarities. What does that mean, Reza, to leverage similarities?
So leverage, it can be a noun or a verb. To leverage, or the leverage you get from something, is, if you like, the maximum benefit for the effort you put in. So, for example, if the third language is related to the second, use your knowledge of the second as a stepping stone. A stepping stone are those stones you find in the middle of rivers that help you cross the river without getting wet. But always watch out for false cognates, words that look similar but mean different things. False friends, in other words. So like in Spanish, sopa, it means soup in English, but you might be tempted to think that it's soap.
Very different to keep your soup and your soap separate, in my experience.
You wash yourself with soap, but you eat soup, unless there's something wrong with you. Yeah. And éxito, or in Valencia, exit, even more so. You think, oh, well, it's got to be exit. It's not, though, is it? Éxito is success, nothing to do with exit. The exit is where you go out, oh, well, actually, there you go. I can show off my second and third language knowledge. So salida is exit in Spanish. But do you know what it is in Valencia?
No idea.
Eixida. It's quite similar to English, actually. Eixida is exit in Valencia, whereas it's salida in Spanish.
That reminds me of my dear brother-in-law, Terry, who sadly passed away during the COVID pandemic. He used to see the word salida in many places, in car parks and shopping malls and Salida. And one day he said to me, this place, Salida, we should go there. It looks very, very popular. There's so many signs to Salida. It must be a fantastic town.
Really? That's funny.
Yeah, he'd only been in Spain for about 12 years when he said that. So it took him a while to not learn Spanish. Let's take a quick break here because I know you listen to this podcast to take your English to the next level. But what about your speaking? Is your fluency improving? Are you happy with your speaking skills? My conversation course focuses on making you a more confident and more fluent English speaker. You'll join me and a small group of motivated students, and we'll meet on Zoom and have topical discussions, role plays, debates, and presentations that will expand your vocabulary and help you express yourself effectively in English. So be proactive and take the first step towards becoming a confident and fluent English speaker. Send me an email today to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll send you details of the next online conversation course. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the podcast. Another tip for you is to practice switching. To switch means to change from one thing to another. And if you spend some time transitioning, changing between languages, for instance, you could practice saying the same sentence in your second language and then in your third language, and do this back to back, which means in succession, one after the other. So you could use French and say one sentence and then immediately switch to your third language, Spanish, and repeat the same sentence in the other language. And that will give you the flexibility of playing with the two languages.
One aspect to bear in mind when you're learning 3 languages or more is the cognitive load. The load is like the weight of something, how much of something you're carrying. And cognitive is to do with your thinking abilities. So it refers to managing multiple languages as being mentally taxing. If something is taxing, is difficult, it's not easy. Nothing to do with taxis, nothing to do with pay tax. It's an adjective, taxing, Taxing, means difficult. But it also strengthens your cognitive abilities over time. So although it's a heavy cognitive load, it's difficult to be learning 2 languages at the same time, it is good for your abilities. And as Craig has already mentioned, it might in the future protect you against things like Alzheimer's. That has been scientifically proven.
Indeed, it has. Definitely those neural networks in your mind that fire and connect.
Yes, in fact, for years, people have been talking about the elasticity of the brain, but they meant it in a metaphorical way. But it was fairly recently, I think in the last 10 or 15 years, where they discovered that it was actually physical as well. So for years and years and years, people have talked about, you got to keep your brain elastic, keep on your toes, but they didn't realize until recently that by elastic, they could have been literal. Your brain, apparently, if it's in good working order, is literally more elastic. People who have Alzheimer's, their brain is not very elastic. It's literally harder, literally physically harder. And people who are at the opposite end of Alzheimer's, they got very good, clear thinking. Their brain, certain parts of their brain are softer because they move. The brain moves physically according to how you shape it. People couldn't have imagined that 50 years ago. Isn't science amazing?
Yeah, it's incredible. It also reminds me of when you leave batteries inside an appliance for too long and it kind of corrodes and gets rusty. That's how I can imagine something happening inside your brain. And it's strange, isn't it? We think of going to the gym to keep our body in shape, to get bigger muscles and keep trim and have a nice figure, but we don't think of doing the same thing with our brain, and maybe we should. So take your brain to the gym and learn a third language. Now, there's another thing that's worth mentioning, and that's when you occasionally mix some words from different languages, not necessarily on purpose. It's called code switching. We had that verb to switch before, to change. So you're changing code, you're switching code. And especially if the languages are similar, you might be mixing the two languages together in the same sentence or in the same expression. This happens to me sometimes when I'm speaking with my wife, who is a Spanish speaker, and we speak a kind of a Spanglish where I might start the sentence in Spanish and then not really know what the next word is in Spanish and change to English and finish the sentence in English. And of course she understands because we've been living together for a long time. But if I spoke to a stranger in the street, they will be very confused. So be careful of this code switching, keeping the languages separate.
I think sometimes code switching is accidental and sometimes done on purpose. Sometimes I purposely change to another language.
Why?
Between Spanish and English, because I just think the thing I'm going to say next is just much easier to understand in Spanish if I'm speaking to someone who speaks Spanish. And I do it, and so do you. I know, because we've done it together.
That's true.
We will even go into Spanish, even though we're two native English teachers who teach English, because it just seems easier.
And sometimes I'm speaking to you and there's nobody else around. My wife's not around, your partner's not around, and we're speaking Spanish. And I think, why am I speaking to Reza in Spanish? He's much easier in English, and we change. But it's done subconsciously without realizing.
Like a classic thing in Valencia, as a good example, is me or Craig or many of our friends and colleagues who teach English, we might say something like, you better avoid the center of Valencia in March around 2:00 because you don't want to get stuck in the Mascletà. It's pointless to try and say that in English, yeah? Or you could even say, a mascletà is a very difficult word to translate, admittedly. But what about fireworks display? We got a perfectly good word for that. But it's like, oh yeah, I really want to go to the beach tonight. I hear they're doing a fantastic castillo. We could say fireworks display, but it just seems appropriate to say it in Spanish because it's such a Valencian thing. So I've noticed myself doing that even with other English speakers, and I think you've done it with me as well. We've switched codes because it just seems that the Spanish word carries more weight for that particular use, or vice versa. Spanish people code switch. They're saying something in Spanish, but then they switch into English because, I'll give you a classic example. You'll always hear people talking in Spain about, admiro mucho los británicos por su fair play. You'll hear that a lot in Spanish. Fair play. It's a very British kind of concept. And you hear people switching from Spanish into English to say that.
Yeah, it's very common in languages like Japanese as well, where there might not necessarily be an equivalent Japanese word for an English modern expression. So you'll hear English words coming through. And I heard that in India as well, that even though they were speaking Hindi, sometimes they would pepper their language with English words that I could understand and almost follow the conversation, or at least know what they're talking about. That expression, to pepper the language, is to put little words, little things, little pieces of English inside the Hindi. Another tip for you is cultural immersion, to immerse yourself culturally in the language. Engage with the culture that is related to the language that you're learning. What does that mean? Well, watch movies in the target language, read books in the target language, follow news in the target language. All of these things to enhance your learning experience. If you put yourself inside the culture, you'll absorb the language much more efficiently.
Yes, this is a very interesting concept we're touching on here. Craig, I've got a question for you. Purely, I'm the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. But you may have noticed it yourself. I've quite often come across Spanish speakers who've said, I want to really get into some cultural immersion, to speak English much, much better. I've got to go to an English-speaking country. And I was like, where will you go? Will you go to England? They go, no, don't want to go to England. Where are you going to go? I'm going to go to Ireland. And I'm not just saying that because I'm Irish, but I've heard a lot of Spanish people saying that. And I think it's because they want to be a bit out of their comfort zone, but not too far. And if you're like most Spanish people, you're probably a Catholic. You might not be a practicing Catholic, but it's a Catholic culture in Spain. And of course, so is most of Ireland. Certainly the Republic of Ireland is as well. And I think that plays a part. So people want the cultural immersion. It's like, the English are a bit more different than us. The Irish, a lot of Spanish people think, are different, but they got things in common. There I can get a bit out of my comfort zone without going too far. Would you say so?
That's interesting to me. I have not heard that. People going to Ireland for religious reasons.
No, not religious, not because
no,
of
because
just the culture, the Catholic culture, but it doesn't mean they're going to go to church.
But I don't really see a huge difference between culturally what they would find in Ireland and what they would find in England from a food perspective.
No, the food's going to be pretty bad, yeah.
Well, yeah.
The weather.
In both places, the weather, the native language, you might hear some Irish, but the native language usually is in English. I don't really see, I mean, I can understand the fact that they might want to go to church, but apart from that, I don't see the influence of the reason for going to a Catholic country.
Well, I think, for example, in Ireland, there are exceptions, and in England, of course, there are exceptions as well. But I would say that still, even in this 21st century, Ireland is a slightly more family-oriented country than England.
True, yeah.
Things like that. So I'm talking about above all for young children or people with young children. But parents, if they're going to send their kids for some cultural immersion, they like the idea of Ireland. Oh, yeah, they'll be in a Catholic family, not necessarily for the religion, but, where family's quite a big deal, the nice traditional nuclear family, is valued, that type of thing. And they have the idea, although maybe it's a stereotype, that there's more chance of finding that in Ireland than in England.
Interesting. I would say that would be more obvious to me if you had said that people wanting that cultural experience went to New York or to Southern California. It's very difficult to avoid Spanish-speaking people from Central and South America working in the service industries in those southern states and in New York. I hear Spanish everywhere. I heard Spanish everywhere when I visited New York. So that would be more of a softer way to try and dip your foot into the English-speaking world. And of course, we've said this many, many times on this podcast, you need to practice regularly. We can't say that enough. Practice, practice, practice. Consistency in language learning is the key. So try as much as possible to incorporate and include these languages into your daily routine through listening to podcasts like this one, reading, speaking, writing. Just make sure you've got that regular habit of practicing.
And last but not least, don't forget to be patient and flexible. Patience and flexibility are essential to learn any language, but even more so if you're going to learn 2 or 3 or more, obviously. So it's a gradual process, and mixing things up, mixing up your second with your third language, it's inevitable at times. It's going to happen, isn't it? I know it happens to me. I'm studying a third language at the moment. So it's part of it. It's not the end of the world. So just be patient with yourself and flexible. And someday when you practice a lot, the things will stay more separate. With most people, you end up separating things better in the long run.
Yes, be kind to yourself. Be nice to yourself. But now it's your turn to practice your English. Are you learning a third or fourth or even fifth language apart from English? If you are, we would love to hear from you. Please send us a voice message and tell us about your third, fourth or fifth or sixth language learning experience. You can do that by contacting us on SpeakPipe and sending us a voice message. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast, and you'll see a link to that voice message service in the show notes.
If you'd prefer to write, you could send an email to either of us or both of us. You've got Craig at inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
Also, we don't know what to speak about next week, so please send us your ideas and suggestions for future episodes. We remind you that if you're a Spanish speaker and you want to improve your English with free and paid resources, you'll find those at Mansion Inglés website, mansioningles.com. And for paid products, you can browse the online store at store.mansioningles.net.
As always, we'd like to say thank you to all our Patreon supporters. Those are the people who join the Patreon program, that's Patreon, and they sponsor us, they give a little donation, and as a way of saying thank you to those people, they get instant access to the audio transcriptions of the podcast episodes. And also, as a fairly recent added extra, we arrange Zoom chats with our sponsors who wish, so that they can practice their speaking a little bit more. If you're interested, have a look in the show notes. There's a link to patreon.com/English podcast.
And before we say goodbye this week, we'd like to welcome our most recent Patreon supporters who have joined us this month. And they are Heselhir Vernot Gusen, Carlos Lopez Galarza, and Malena Ribas Bellafont. Thank you to you and to all of our wonderful Patreon supporters that are helping us to keep this podcast going. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell a friend so that more people can listen. And until next time, thanks for your company this week. It's goodbye from Reza.
And it's adios from Craig.
What's adios in Valencia?
Adeu.
Adeo. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.